Early October 1982, Logan, the typically quiet county seat of Ohio's Hocking Hills, is shocked by a pair of frightful murders and dismemberments. What follows is a twisting story involving lovers, villains, botched investigations, witchcraft, drugs, a wrongful conviction, and the community's loss of life and innocence. This is Township Falls. In the last episode, we covered all the occult activity in the Hocking Hills. Now you know all about the witches and warlocks roaming around the county selling flowers and hugging trees. As this episode covers the court proceedings, you might notice that we have omitted last names for some of the civilian witnesses that are mentioned, out of respect for their privacy.
Chapter 4, Standing Room Only. A crowd of just under 100 townspeople gathered as Dale arrived in town, handcuffed and accused of murdering his stepdaughter Annette Cooper and her boyfriend/fiancé Todd Schultz. The crowd roared. It had been a long and scary year, but finally, justice would prevail. Dale was led into the courtroom, which was packed with people from Todd and Annette's lives, where he entered a plea of not guilty. He was denied bail. We finally had Dale, and there was no way he was getting away with it. I can recall being a little girl in 1984 when this case went to trial. I attended Rockbridge Elementary, just a few miles north of Logan. My elementary school principal was an older man, skinny with graying hair and glasses. His name was Dale Johnson. In my kindergarten brain, I was fairly sure that they were one and the same. To say this had an effect on my behavior was an understatement. I had it worked out that if you were bad at school, you were likely to be killed. I was as quiet as a mouse. I wanted nothing more than to be good and live through the school day. I laugh about this now because Mr. Dale Johnson of Rockbridge Elementary was a kind older man who smelled of garlic and had the patience of a saint. He later accompanied my 6th grade class on the annual rite of passage trip to Washington, D.C. But I tell you this story because as a child in Logan, there was never a question of, was he guilty? We needed Dale to be guilty so that our lives could go back to being the quiet, maybe a little boring lives that they were before the fall of 1982. I can recall, as I got older, sometimes I would see Dale pop up on the news, and I would resign myself to be good again, old habits and all.
In the fall of 1983, when Dale was brought in on his murder charges, the newspaper printed a special edition, and more than 2,000 copies were sold the first night. The newsstand had to stay open late to accommodate the demand for the juicy bit of long-awaited news. In a town like Logan, they rolled up the sidewalks at 8 p.m. I can't recall anything but the bars like the Shamrock, the Hideaway, or maybe a gas station or pizza crossing being open later than 9 p.m. Not even Graff's Gifts, run by Neil Graff, would have been open that late on a normal night. The first night Dale was in custody, he was moved to nearby Pickaway County. It was very likely that Dale would be lynched in Logan. People were worked up. As he was led away, someone in the crowd spit on Dale. My sister Kim, en route to work in Circleville, had to pull over as a parade of sheriff's cruisers took Dale in. Over the next several months, there would be another search of the Johnston farm, which would turn up a machete at the Johnston's property, which could have been one of the weapons used to dismember the teens.
It didn't take too long before there was a trial. By early November, a pool of jurors had been selected. 75 were chosen. It took about 4 months for the case to hit a courtroom. Early in January, Dale's attorneys put in a bid for a 6-week delay for the trial, which was denied. But the attorneys truly believed there was no way that this case could return a guilty verdict, despite the fact that the trial was happening in Logan, in the very courthouse I participated in mock trial in as a teenager in the 1990s. Dale waived his rights to a jury trial, knowing that he could never have a fair jury in Logan. There was too much talk, too much need for justice. Dale's attorney stated that this case spelled out Dale was innocent, and you would see and hear from witnesses that proved a satanic cult was responsible. When you look at the actual credible evidence and witness testimony, this case seems simple. Does being naked at home with your family mean you are a cold-blooded killer? So on January 11th, 1984, Dale Johnson went on trial for the murders of Todd and Annette. It was bitterly cold this morning. Temperatures were recorded at -4 the previous night. But the people lined up outside the courthouse, determined to get a spot in the courtroom where the seats would be limited to 75. Snow and ice be damned. No one could miss this, no matter how treacherous the weather or roads might be. With so many rumors of sex, scandal, and murder, everyone wanted to hear these details for themselves and figure out fact from fiction. This was by far the most sensational thing to ever happen in Logan. The spectator seats filled quickly, but before the trial could even begin, Dale's experienced Columbus lawyers pointed out that the prosecutors had withheld information and evidence that was in favor of Dale Johnston's defense.
The prosecution stated, if such info existed, they had also never seen it, from the police department, which is interesting. But one of the three judges declared that any such information would be produced and shared, and then the trial got underway. But as quickly as it started, the court recessed so that the parties would be able to view Johnston's mobile home and farm. The courthouse party visited the snow-covered farm outside of Logan for a quarter of an hour or so. Johnston was there, handcuffed and chatting with Deputy Burt Clay as the specifics were discussed. This would be the last time Dale would ever see his farm with the buildings intact, and his marks upon the land. I wonder if Dale had known this, if he would have taken the side in a little longer without the chit-chat. Or if he would just like to forget this time in Hocking County altogether at this point.
From there, they visited the murder scene in the West Logan cornfield. You can see a photo of the judges standing on the tracks on this day on our site and on our social media. Another bitterly cold night settled over the Hocking Hills. Again, the temperatures dipped below zero, but the spectators were not deterred from witnessing the biggest thing to ever happen in their city. If hell had frozen over, the people would have bundled up and waited, even if this trial took a lifetime to get through. Jim Ganal, a well-known meteorologist from Columbus, testified about the weather conditions on October 4th, 1982, and the weather in the days to follow the discovery of the torsos and the body parts. Ganal stated that there had been heavy rains on October 7th and October 9th, and how this would have affected the soil around the river and the burial sites.
Don Schultz told the court about the last time he saw his son Todd at the fire department, where Don worked and Todd volunteered. Don expected to see his son again that night for the meeting at the fire department. He spoke of how he watched his son drive off down Mulberry Street and how Todd waved to him. Don also speaks of how desperate Todd was to get cash, to get into an apartment. Sandra testified that teens had a light meal at her house. She said Todd had not drank any alcohol before leaving her house, though the autopsy report stated otherwise. Both of Todd's parents testified, along with the neighbor lawyer, about Todd's last day and the things that they said to Todd, only after they were reminded about the rules of hearsay. If you're not familiar with hearsay, basically it means that you can't say what someone else says to you, but you can say what you said to them. The parents' testimonies would be considered big points for the prosecution. The neighbor testified that Todd seemed desperate to get some cash and that he spoke with Todd the day he died about the Buick Dale and Sarah had promised Annette, and how a parent-child agreement is not enforceable in court.
The prosecution called BCI's Mr. Herman Henry to the stand. He testified that the scene was in disarray and that he tried to assist in the investigation by following up on leads and submitting written reports to Detective Thompson, who wasn't interested in the help. So many disturbing details were brought out in the trial. Dr. Patrick Fardahl completed the autopsies and he reported that Todd was shot 5 times. 2 shots to the head, 1 from a close range of under 3 feet, once in the chest, once in the arm, once in the back. Annette was shot 2 times, once in the head and once in the neck. But unfortunately, that wasn't the only details of the teens' murders. The teens would be dismembered and mutilated before being buried in shallow graves only about 8 inches deep. Their genitals were cut away. Todd's heart had been pierced by a knife. Todd's torso had a cross carved into it. A part of Todd's lung was sliced. Annette's fingernails were broken off. She only had 3 remaining when she was discovered. Under one of those remaining fingernails was 1 brown hair, which was consistent with Todd's hair.
Dr. Fardile suggested the stomach contents to be consistent with the teens eating a light meal several hours before they died, and that was in line with what Sandra Schultz had reported, that the teens had a sandwich at her house. But he also noted that the alcohol in Todd's system suggested that Todd had drank a beer shortly before he died. Todd's family had always asserted that Todd didn't drink or do drugs, but what was the prosecution suggesting by bringing up the alcohol? That Dale was mad enough to kill these two, but he might have paused in his rampage to share a beer with Todd before shooting him 5 times and dismembering him? Regardless of what the prosecution was trying to imply, it was safe to say that Todd drank a beer shortly before he died. But that leads to a great question. Where did Todd drink a beer shortly before he died? It's worth mentioning that sometimes the human body can produce blood alcohol during the decomposition process, but in this case only Todd had alcohol in his system, and Annette did not. Dr. Fardile noted in the autopsy that there were 2 persons responsible for the cuts made on the victims. Some of the dismemberments were precise and smooth cuts, others were jagged and hacking style cuts.
The Logan Police Chief, Steve Barron, testified that Johnston had a conversation with him in early October about how the teens were making him look bad with the accusations the Schultz family was making. Jim Jones, the sheriff of Hocking County, is called to the stand. The defense produces a transcript of some recorded calls between Jones and Johnston. This surprised Jones because while he admitted to speaking with Dale several times, and even discussing the gunshots in the cornfield, Jones stated he never recorded any of the calls. He found out then that Johnston had recorded the calls. Jones also testified that there was a spot in the cornfield just around 200 yards from the burial sites that contained burned clothing. Ashes were sent off to BCI, but found not to be relevant to the case.
Jones goes on to state that during the investigation, he witnessed Mallory pick up, then discard a feed bag. Jones examined the bag, noted the stains, and kept it as evidence. Jones said he told Johnston if Mallory didn't quit, he would have been fired. Jones testifies that he spoke with Dale Johnson about the gunshots in the cornfield. It's worth noting that while Mallory is mentioned several times and testifies in court, and he also has given several interviews over the years, he did in fact quit about a month after the discovery of the body parts. Former Captain Steve Mallory takes the stand and shares a few conversations he had with the Johnston family. He spoke of the relationship between the couple and stated that Dale thought of Todd like he was part of the family. Of course, those odd nude photos of Annette were mentioned. Mallory testified that Dale shared a lot of details about the nudity at home, but he admits he took no notes nor made any recordings despite being trained and having the ability to do so.
If you watch any of the very limited coverage on this case, you can tell the nudity really bothers everyone involved and still does to date. When Detective Thompson takes the stand, he leaves out a lot of the exciting things about his interrogation of Johnston. He recounts the events in a flat, expressionless voice. To watch the old, grainy VHS-style court tapes, it seems as if Dale just volunteers all of this information without Thompson even having to ask. Thompson tells the story that Dale wanted to confess to all of the dirty things he had done to Annette. He states that Dale came into the police station a week after the teens were found to talk about psychic visions. Thompson testifies that these visions happened in the precise location of where the bodies were found and involved water and trees. It should be noted, at the trial, the defense accused Detective Thompson of fabricating a good bit of his testimony. Deputy Robinson testified that he had made an appointment to interview a young man named Charles. This man had reported that he saw a couple having sex near the crime scene on the day the couple had died, and the couple looked like Todd and Annette. Robinson stated that instead of Charles showing up for the interview, none other than Detective Jim Thompson showed up and let him know that the interview was canceled. If the teens were seen having sex at the river, it would be hard for Dale to be forcing them into a car in town. It is becoming easy to see that any lead that didn't end up on the Johnston's doorstep was ignored. Any evidence that didn't lead right to Dale should be corrected until it does, much like Steve Ryan in the hypnotism, but we'll get to that in a moment. Several of Annette's friends were called to testify, including her best friend, Annette. Prosecution tried to get the friend to comment on the situation at the Johnston home, but the judges reminded them of the hearsay situation. All Annette could really do was stammer out that Annette had a problem she wanted to go to her mother about, and maybe the police. The prosecution tried to come in the back door by asking if Annette Cooper ever mentioned problems with her stepfather, but that was sustained. Annette had nothing more to offer. Also, wouldn't that be considered hearsay? I'm not a lawyer, and I had to look up the legal definition at some point in wading through all of this. Hearsay is defined as the report of another person's words by a witness, which is usually disallowed as evidence in a court of law. Annette's friend Mike, who was actually my husband's cousin, took the stand and claimed Annette had told him she was pregnant by her stepfather in the 1981-82 school year. I think that would count as hearsay, but sometimes it is allowed in this case and sometimes not. It's hard to keep up with the flexible rules at times. Now earlier we talked about that weird phenomenon of getting naked pics of your kids in the 70s and 80s. Remember that? Most kids were horrified by these pictures, but apparently Annette wasn't. Her friend and neighbor Linda testified that Annette had shown the photos, yes, the naked pictures with the gun, to her. I also want to take this brief moment to stand corrected. In an earlier episode, I smugly thanked my mom for not taking bathtub photos of me in the 1980s. Well, how about that? I actually do have some of these cringe photos in my possession.
Dana, a classmate at Hocking Tech, testifies about the shoes. Recall the rumor mentioned earlier about how Sarah helped kill her daughter and took her shoes off of her feet? Dana Pulling said she saw Annette wearing the brown suede shoes in question at college that day, opening the door to the accusation of Sarah being an accomplice. The manager of the strip mine on the Johnston's property, Mr. Summers, testified that Dale had come to him in August after Annette had moved out and asked him to fire Annette from her part-time job, but he didn't fire Annette, and they never spoke of it again. However, Mr. Summer did testify that Annette kept working part-time, and she'd go around to have lunch with Dale. He also testified that Annette wasn't upset about things at her parents' home, but she was growing tired of the contentious atmosphere in the Schultz's home. The prosecution's best witness, if you can say that, was Steve Ryan, the boyfriend of a cousin of the Schultz family, who had been presented to law enforcement by Don Schultz. Ryan was hypnotized to place Dale, Todd, and Annette together on October the 4th. When Steve Ryan takes the stand, the defense attorney objects, as his testimony is loaded with suggestive comments. Steve Ryan should not have been allowed to take the stand, as his story had already been checked out to be the group home runaways by the sheriff's department. But Steve was all they had for this case.
Dale's attorney points out that there is no way for this witness to differentiate his pre- and post-hypnotic memories, but the judges aren't hearing it. Finally, the defense attorney calls confabulation, which is described as a mixture of fact and fantasy to bridge the gaps between events. The testimony of this one man, who frankly gives a variety of statements about what kind of vehicle, who he saw, what they said, how many people were in the vehicle, varies wildly. At some point, he is even asked if he lied to investigators, and he says, "I guess you could take it that way." I know how Steve got caught up in all of this, as this witness was discovered by Don Schultz, but wow. Steve ends up being on the stand even longer than Dale Johnston in his own trial. This testimony and the hypnotism are the evidentiary basis of an entire double murder case. Let that sink in. It's all they have aside from an awful lot of hearsay and speculation, and it's not very solid evidence. But they have that boot print.
Let's talk about that boot print. As the body parts were discovered, someone noticed a boot print on the bank of the river. Searchers and law enforcement had been all over the area for days, and as we have established, the area had not been well preserved from the start. But Sheriff Jones deduced that the print could be from the killer, so he marks off the area. After a few days and some rainfall, a casting was made. It was sent off to the FBI back in December of 1982. The print and the boots were examined and compared. FBI analyst William Bodziak found that the boots and the print were not a match. Additionally, Bodziak noted that the print was likely made by a bare foot. He did suggest another avenue the cops might take. Not to be deterred, the Logan police took Bodziak's suggestions that if they wanted to go further into this print, they might contact an anthropologist in North Carolina, Louise Robin, who was somewhat an expert in forensic footprints. She claimed that a footprint was nearly as unique as a fingerprint. It took 6 months to get a report back from Robbins, and it was well worth the wait. She claimed that by the wear pattern of the boots submitted, she could definitely link Dale Johnston to the print left in the mud, although the FBI couldn't. Robbins was unable to travel to the courthouse to testify, but she did appear in the courtroom via a videotape. She talked about how she could go beyond the scope of the casting and examine the wear patterns of the shoes to say with certainty who had been wearing the shoes. Robbins testified via tape that she had only published one study of her area of expertise, but had been called to testify in many cases. Robbins is interesting, and she surely fits with the case and that they were trying to build. Some 10 years in the future after her death, CBS 48 Hours would examine her testimony in a dozen or so cases, including this one. The takeaway from that is this: all of her testimonies in these murder cases in question was highly suspect, and it was scientifically unverifiable. Anyway, Robbins wasn't afraid to verify the boot print was that of Dale Johnston's. She was more knowledgeable than the FBI in this case. While this all seems like a lot of smoke and mirrors, and I don't know of a logical judge who would go with a self-proclaimed expert without much to back her science up after an FBI analyst, but that was exactly what happened here. Robbins wasn't done though. She'd give her opinions on that brown suede pair of shoes that Dana said Annette wore to school that day she died. She examined the brown suede shoes and a pair of Annette's boots, and wouldn't you know it, the wear patterns were a match. So those brown suede shoes pulled from Sarah's closet surely had been on the feet of her daughter when she was shot and dismembered. To hear the court proceedings, the prosecution lays it out that Sarah valued a pair of shoes more than her daughter's life. Robbins shook things up and made this story seem even sadder than it had before. A pair of shoes held more value than Annette's life in this whole story.
Bodiak was in Logan, and he gave a brief in-person testimony during the trial. He stated that he couldn't definitively link the print to Dale, and he said the casting was of poor quality. I wonder if he had any regrets about suggesting that they contact Robbins, especially in the years after the popular show 48 Hours was finished discrediting her work. Well, she wasn't the only anthropologist they called to the stand. The defense calls in Dr. Clyde Snow, who was once the medical examiner in Chicago. Dr. Snow was a part of the panel that presented on JFK's assassination to the Congressional Committee. He was internationally known and respected, and he had many impressive credentials under his belt. He stated that what Robbins was attempting to do, match boot prints to prints, went beyond the scope of forensic anthropology. For those that might not know exactly what forensic anthropology is, it is the identification of skeletal remains and has little to do with boots, prints, or shoes. What Robbins was actually doing was dabbling in criminalistics, and she was not qualified to do that. In fact, Dr. Snow testified that he had challenged the one study Robbins published and said that the only standard in forensic anthropology that she met was the one that she set for herself.
A senior firearms examiner from BCI, Thomas Nicholson, testified that the bullets that killed Todd and Annette were not fired from the rifle that had been confiscated from the Johnston property. A microanalysis expert testified that she found type O and type A blood, head hair consistent with Todd's dark hair on one of the plastic-type feed sacks that were submitted as evidence.
There were many witnesses called. Some witnesses even placed Dale Johnston and the teens at the optometrist's office where Sarah worked on the night of October 4th, 1982. One of Annette's former boyfriends, John, testified that he had to break up with Annette due to some scary phone calls he had received. He claimed that he suspected the calls came from both Dale and his son Dale Ray. This young man claimed that Annette had told both him and his mother of her troubles at home. This is interesting because when Dale's attorney objected to these statements, because here we go again with hearsay, the 3-judge panel decided that they would actually allow this statement in order to establish a state of mind. But it was okay because they wouldn't take these statements at face value. This witness went on to say that he was warned if he had sex with Annette, they would both be castrated. These calls went on, counting down the days that John had to live. The first call said 15 days. The calls progressed, and the countdown of days grew smaller. This young man couldn't take the pressure. He broke things off with Annette Cooper. I tried for months to track this witness down, as I really wanted to know about these calls. They certainly imply that Johnston was possessive of his stepdaughter. I don't know, if someone were calling my son, threatening to castrate him over a girl, I think I would have a royal fit. But that is one of those things we can only speculate over at this point. It makes you wonder how this witness was found, and if the story was coached. John, if you ever listen to this, please call me.
Finally, Sarah took the stand on January 19th, 1984. The prosecution asked her about the inappropriate relationship with her daughter and husband. She denied having any knowledge of that. She was a solid witness, but she did decline to testify about some things as she invoked marital rights. The prosecution continued to press Sarah about a conversation that was overheard on October the 5th. When speaking to Dale via phone at work, she made a statement that went something like this: "I don't care if you raped her every day of the week. I just want my baby back in one piece." Sarah acknowledges that yes, she did say that after the accusations made in the second call from Sandra Schultz. Sarah maintained the same story she had told all along, that she went to work, picked up her younger daughter Michelle, she purchased a newspaper and some snack cakes, then went home to prepare a meal for her family. When she arrived home with Michelle, she saw Dale speaking to two men near the barn. They had dinner, she went back to work for the evening appointments, and then she came home. She had that odd call from Sandra. She went to bed. It wouldn't do to not ask Sarah about the details of the family's nudist practices, so they asked and got an info on that too. She insists the only touching she ever witnessed between Dale and Annette was like a pat on the shoulder, nothing inappropriate. Sarah's testimony remained consistent with what she had told law enforcement upwards of 20 times, as she had been interviewed and questioned many times.
Michelle Cooper, 4 years younger than Annette, is called to the stand. Michelle had been designated the court's witness, which meant she could be cross-examined and leading questions could be asked. Michelle had been interrogated by Thompson numerous times, and there were all kinds of rumors going around about her too. People in Logan told stories about how one day Michelle was in class and she just lost it and started to break down and tell all. She was removed from her mother's care after her sister died and was placed into foster care. People said she had witnessed the murders out at the trailer and had maybe even helped get rid of the bodies. The trauma she had witnessed caused her to have amnesia. After so many interrogations and questioning, Michelle had only been able to come up with one coping mechanism to shut down. Michelle didn't know who killed her sister, and her memory of October 4th was hazy at best. Michelle did tell the court that she had never seen Dale carrying a knife or a pistol.
Of course, there were witnesses called who had heard gunshots in the cornfield. The court heard from witnesses such as Shirley and Clarence, who was a part-time security guard at a company within the industrial area. At 5:45 p.m., he heard the gunshots fired from the area of the cornfield, and it was definitely a .22 caliber gun. Clarence testified about his trip to work about 2 a.m. on October the 5th. He told the court about the noises he heard and how he opted to take the long way around on his motorcycle instead of walking up on whatever was going on by the river that night. These witnesses stated they had reported all this info to the police, but because it pointed away from Dale, these calls were ignored.
5 or 6 of Dale's friends and neighbors testified that they had never seen Dale packing around any weapons. The accusations of sexual abuse are strong in this case. They are the basis for the whole case as we know it. And there are no shortages of folks in town who are more than happy to say they knew all about it. It is funny that sometimes hearsay is admissible, but sometimes it isn't in this case.
Deborah, who was on the Queen's Committee for the Parade of the Hills, takes a stand. She talked about having lunch with Annette during the week of the festivities. She stammers out finally that Annette had said, What was she supposed to say, that her father had raped her? Hearsay rules couldn't touch the statement. Annette herself is in the courtroom on this day. A videotaped interview of her plays. She's dressed up, perfectly polished, vibrantly alive. In the interview, she's asked who her influences in life were and why. She responds, My parents have. They let me make my own mistakes. My parents have helped me through a lot that way. She speaks of her plans to marry Todd and to get a job working with computers. Deborah clears up that Annette felt she had to say that. What was she supposed to say, that her father had raped her? Deborah admits she asked Annette if she was kidding, and she couldn't tell if Annette was lying. While she says she was dumbfounded at such an accusation, much like anyone who claimed to know of these accusations of abuse, she didn't do a thing with the knowledge. She didn't make any reports or contact police or child services. She just mumbled sorry and went on with her day hanging around the teenage beauty queen contestants, further illustrating that the pageant industry is a wild place. We sexualize the girls, then when someone treats them like sexual objects, we mumble, oops, and walk away. Linda, who was also part of the pageant committee of the Parade of the Hills, has supplied this tape, and she also takes a stand to testify.
After nearly 3 weeks, Dale Johnston takes the stand. He maintained the same persona he had possessed all along that led to the townsfolk not liking him. Dale recounted the night Annette had proclaimed, "Shoot those sons of bitches, Daddy." He talked about taking the photos the next day, and even turning the photos over to the police 6 years later. Dale didn't seem to think there was a problem with the photos. Again, you must think of the time. Think back to your own childhood and the embarrassing bathtub phenomenon of the day. Today, it might land you in prison, but back then, it was just a thing people did, I guess. During Dale's testimony, he has an air of disbelief, like he cannot figure out why he is here. He knew he had not murdered anyone, but the town wouldn't hear him out. What Dale didn't understand was that in Hocking County, a man who would sit around in his own home naked, well, there was simply no telling what someone like that would be able to do. If you look into this case, you could find several clips that feature Steve Mowry looking disturbed as can be, mentioning Dale and his fondness for nudity at home. It makes you wonder if some of the people in town had ever removed their own clothing for any reason at all. They seemed to be shocked at the suggestion of being nude because it felt good. The idea that a naked body is nothing to be ashamed of was not an idea that had been accepted in Hocking County in 1982.
For the most part, Johnson was stoic and emotionless on the stand. But when he spoke of the love of horses he shared with Annette, you could see the pride in his face as he spoke of Annette and her many accomplishments and her love of the animals. It was clearly something that they enjoyed together. Just weeks before her death, Dale and Annette had gone to nearby Columbus, Ohio, to show her horse for 4-H. Dale said the horse did lousy, but Annette was great at showing her horse. On the day after the horse showing, Todd came out to the property to swim. The teens were caught changing clothes together, and a fight ensued that would lead Annette to the Schultz's home. Dale claimed that Annette told him she left to clear her head and to be certain that she could live with Todd forever before she married him. That would be the last time Dale ever saw Todd.
Dale said he knew he was a suspect from the first interrogation, and he offered to take a lie detector test, although one was never administered. Had he passed, it would have been too damaging to the case in court. One of the defense attorneys asked Dale if he loved Annette, and he says, "Yes, I did." Now, this trial had been going on for a while. As it went on, nearly 20 threatening letters were sent to the 3 judges. Some were odd, some were scary, and one was just bizarre. It contained an opposition to the death penalty with a rather shocking illustration.
As the prosecutors began to wrap things up, they even offered a scenario. Todd and Annette had been lured by Dale out to Trowbridge Road to the farm to collect that little Buick that they had promised to give Annette for a graduation gift. The way Todd's corpse had been mutilated was evidence to how deep Dale's hatred for Todd went. Dale was so angry and jealous of Todd that he didn't just shoot him, he ripped him apart.
The allegations of abuse and molestation trumped any need for evidence in this long, drawn-out case. In fact, in closing statements, the prosecutor, Mong, has to make this point again with the statement of, "Incest, like rape, is not a sexual occurrence, but it is one of, indeed, abuse, dehumanization, and violence." He says a few other things in reference to cars and the truth, and follows it with, "The ultimate form of incest is murder." He gives some commentary about the findings from the autopsy. As the defense makes closing statements, they bring up a letter that Annette had written to a friend just days before she died. In this letter, she didn't say she was afraid to go home because of Dale abusing her, but she did say that she was quite upset about the sexual etiquette within Todd's home. Annette wrote to her friend that Sandra had told her to get out of her house. when she found out Todd and Annette were making use of Dawn's apartment to have sex. There had also been some reports about Sandra being cool with the young couple's sex life initially, but then her opinions had changed about that and she was no longer so accepting. We know that she threw the birth control pills at Dale when he first tried to collect Annette's things.
The defense states that Dale was a scapegoat for local law enforcement and alludes to the satanic activity in the hills. Thomas Tyak, one of Johnson's attorneys, states that many of the claims made left room for the greater than a reasonable doubt. They did not call Hilson, whom we spoke of in the last episode, to testify. Before the judges retreated to come to a decision, Dale's attorney Bob Sir reminded the courtroom that the Schultz family was not the only ones to lose a child, but also Dale and Sarah had the added burden of being accused of murdering these kids.
And that is something no one seems to remember in all of this, that the Johnston Cooper family also suffered a loss. They would never see bright and bubbly, cute as a button Annette again. They had been accused of some horrible things in the process too. How would they ever recover from this ordeal and begin their lives again with their new reality? The judges deliberated for under 3 hours. They let everyone know, as the verdicts were delivered, no bad behaviors would be tolerated. Everyone took that to heart, so the seats were mostly empty in the spectator section. The people gathered down below, much like they had when all this began. They would hear the verdict over the local radio broadcast. Sarah Johnston did not return to the courtroom, but the Schultz family was there, ready to hear the word. The first verdict of 2 was read. The room was so quiet that Dale's lawyer, Tyak, wasn't sure what had been said. But the cheering and the jeering started just like it had when they brought Dale in back in September. Sheriff Jimmy Jones appears from 2 stories above on the balcony, where he holds up his hands in the victory symbol.
People in town celebrated so hard that an employee at a nearby restaurant said, "I never heard such a noise. People cheering and honking their horns. I thought it was a wedding. Instead, it was a man's life at stake." I was ashamed of Logan. Sentencing would happen in the future, but as far as the people were concerned, it was a done deal and nothing less than a death penalty conviction would do. An elated Sandra Schultz cheers as the guilty verdict being read. The phone at the Schultz home rang with happy friends and family, calling to share in the good news. Sandra said they popped open a bottle of champagne and made a toast to justice, not to the memory of their son nor his girlfriend, the 2 mostly forgotten victims, but to their sense of justice. Jim Jones took extra precautions to ensure Dale would be safe from a lynch mob, and as his lawyers left, they were escorted out of the county for their own safety. Sarah sat across the street at a local restaurant. She could have gone to hear the verdict in person, but there was no need to do that. The mood in the courthouse was odd. People were as excited as a kid on Christmas Eve at the idea of her husband being found guilty. Sarah knew Dale had not killed the kids. She in fact described Dale as one of the sweetest, kindest, most gentle men she had ever known. As the people began to cheer, Sarah knew the verdict had been read and her husband had been found guilty in a court of law by a panel of judges.
Don Schultz recites the words you can find on the Hocking County Courthouse. "Never shall we deny right or justice," he states. It really fit in this case. Of course, if the verdict had gone the other way, I would have wanted the county commissioners to sandblast it off. I will let you think about that for a second. Chances are he likely could have had that saying removed. He has demonstrated he had power where it counted. But no less true words could have applied to this case. Dale was denied both right and justice.
Sentencing would not happen until March of 1983, but people wanted and expecting nothing less than the death penalty. As the sentence was read, Dale sat emotionless, wearing the same brown suit he had worn every day throughout the trial. Dale was sentenced to death by the electric chair. The date was set. Dale would be executed on October the 4th, 1984, exactly 2 years from the day the teens were killed.
Don Schultz gave a thumbs up, literally, and offered to foot the bill for the electric chair. He said, "When they burn him, I'll pay the electric bill. This is what we were hoping for. He killed my son and my son's girlfriend. He broke the law. He has to pay for it." Sandra Schultz said Dale got what he deserved. He knew that the death penalty existed when he killed the kids. She expressed that she wished she had done something about Annette being abused all those years ago when she knew about it, but only let her move into the house and took no action. This wasn't the end for Sarah and her nightmare come to life. It was truly only a middle point of her troubles.
Dale was stunned, but he didn't lose hope. He remained incarcerated awaiting his sentencing. Michelle was still in foster care. The people in Hocking County were relieved to say the least. This nightmare would be laid to rest in the past, and people could finally breathe again. The Moonies and the cult slowly faded from both conversation and sight, although honestly I can't recall or find out exactly when they all went away. But you will enjoy knowing that by the time I became a teenager in the 1990s, there was a new set of cult-like gossip swirling about in Logan. They were the infamous nudists of the Lake Logan area. Locals laughingly called it Bare-Ass Beach in my day. When a sentence was delivered, it was what the people wanted. Sort of. It was a death row conviction. Dale was scheduled to die by the electric chair. The people in Logan were satisfied, but they sure wish they could fry him twice. This is Township Falls.
In the next episode, we follow Dale Johnston to death row and check in to see how his remaining relatives are handling things. Music by Rich Rat Vasky in layman's terms. Hey, this is your chance to weigh in. Did you know Todd or Annette or Dale or any of the players in this story? Give us a call on our recorded line at 419-777-1147 to give us the scoop. You can also follow us on social media to see photos from the case and other cool photos of the Hocking Hills circa the 1980s. Don't forget to share this podcast with your true crime and history-loving friends. Thanks for listening.